Bayview Entertainment and the 3D Film Archive bring to Blu-ray the sort of long-lost, certainly forgotten 3D feature from 1972, Domo Arigato, in 3D. It is in 3D. It's in multiple forms of 3D. It's also in 2D. I want to get into all of that to the best of my knowledge, speaking with the best of my knowledge about 3D. This is a film that was directed by Oboler, who is mostly known for doing the first, commonly referred to the first 3D feature, Buona Devil, in the 50s, the film that really kind of, I think, kicked off the 3D craze in the 50s, as well as the Lights Out radio series he was known for. This is a film, it's basically a travelogue. This really reminded me a lot of some of the Cinerama films, which were either flat-out travelogues or there would be a very thin story that went through the film to have a reason why the camera is pointing at all these things in various parts of the world. This is all entirely shot in Japan. It is shot in 3D. You can watch this, as I said, in 2D. You can watch it in anaglyph 3D, which is the colors differ, but basically the red-blue. Most people think of 3D, that's what they think of. And it is in actual legit 3D. If you have a 3D Blu-ray player or a 3D TV or a projector that can project 3D, that's the optimal way to watch this in 3D, and I'll get into why a little bit later. It is the story of two young lovers. It's two young people who meet in Japan. She is sort of this sort of distant woman who's sightseeing and won't really say why she's sightseeing and all that. And he is a guy who I think recently they sort of indicate that he was maybe a Vietnam soldier and he's gotten out of that. And they're both looking to find themselves, and what they find is each other. And mostly it's just a lot of excuses to go and look at things, to look at a nightclub performance in Japan, or look at the pagodas, or look at various really cool scenic stuff. And as somebody who's not been to Japan and not been to the Japan of 1972, it was interesting to me. Story-wise, really not very interesting, but there's not, as Joe Bob would say, there's not too much story getting in the way of the plot in this film. You're really kind of watching this for the 3D. They do present it in 2D, which is cool if you don't have the ability to watch 3D, or you just want to see a fairly well-shot travelogue set in Japan in 72. You got that. So here's the deal with the 3D. In order for anaglyph 3D, which is what most people can watch on their TVs because 3D TVs are not made anymore, 3D Blu-ray players are not widely common. I'm thrilled that places like the 3D Film Archive keep doing these restorations and putting them out in what I call proper 3D for people who do have that equipment, or people like me who want to get that equipment so that I can watch this stuff properly one day. I love that that's out there alongside the versions that are easier to see for normal people. So 3D, most people think of as anaglyph. It was never really the common way to look at 3D theatrically. It's something that was a compromise. Originally, 3D was two projectors running two prints interlocked in sync, one for the right eye, one for the left eye, and then they had a polarized glasses, and there was a way that made it work, and it worked. It worked incredibly well. I've seen two projector interlock 3D, and it's phenomenal. Eventually, theaters did away with the two projectors. It was bulky to ship two sets of film prints. You'd have to have an intermission in the middle of it. You'd have to do very accurate splicing, because if you spliced one print, if you didn't splice the other, it would be out of sync and it would make everybody's eyes cross and brains bleed. So eventually it went to one strip of film with the red and the blue thing, and that was common maybe 70s, 80s. It was really more used for print material and things like that. Eventually into the 80s, you got into a different over-under 3D, they called it, which I believe is what this was, a different format of 3D, Space Vision 3D was the version of 3D used for Domo Arigato. Eventually you had that, and that still allowed the film to be on one print. If you think about the 80s 3D films, if you think about Space Hunter or Parasite or Friday the 13th Part 3, The Man Who Wasn't There, all that stuff, that was that, I think Paramount was the one, the unit I've seen, the prism unit that I see that would be attached to the lens. It would be one strip of film. The two eyes would basically be one over the other, squashed in a film frame, and there's this prism attachment you would put on the lens, and it would recombine those to be one double image on screen with your 3D glasses that were grayish, polarized glasses. And that worked pretty well. Films tended to be kind of grainy, but it worked pretty well. So that's the kind of 3D we're talking about here. In order to be able to see this on your normal TV, it's the red-blue. It's the anaglyph 3D. And anaglyph 3D only ever works so well, but unfortunately it doesn't really work well with anything that's in color, because the colors in the image that you're looking at, that you're trying to make into 3D, compete. So in order to make it work for this version here, the folks at the 3D Film Archive and their tech had to really kind of desaturate the film image. So what you're looking at doesn't have a lot of color in it aside from the red and blue used to create 3D effect. How does the 3D effect work? Anaglyph is always kind of dodgy. The 3D effect works pretty well. There are times, though, where something is being pointed right at the screen, which is what, Dr. Tung's 3D House of Stewardesses. Something is being pointed directly at the screen. Sometimes it tends to split in two, unfortunately. What I learned from the extras on this is that Space Vision 3D apparently, I get choked up when I talk about 3D formats. Space Vision 3D apparently really excelled at looking like things were floating out over the audience and coming out of the screen, which to me, as a cheap yokel who's always looking for coming at you gimmicks, stuff coming out is cool. Depth is really where 3D excels most of the time, but sometimes if you're really successful and you can get that feeling that something is coming out of the screen at you, it's really pretty cool. That effect doesn't really work terribly well in the Anaglyph version here, but the depth works great. Some of the titles don't fare terribly well. The end titles on my monitor, I really couldn't read just due to the coloring in the Anaglyph. But other than that, it works well. And if you want to get a kick out of looking at Japan in 1972 in 3D and Japanese go-go dancers in 3D, it still does kind of work and it's fun. People like me will have this and will watch it that way. Also, it's interesting if you look at the 2D version, you really see what a lush, colorful film this is and how much they had to dial the 3D down in order for that Anaglyph 3D to work. The ideal version to watch this is, of course, the actual BR 3D, the actual Blu-ray 3D that this is really being intended to see. And if you have that setup, if you have those glasses, that system, it's going to look phenomenal because it's going to be in lush, full color, and the 3D is going to work incredibly well. One day, I keep getting these discs. I keep buying these discs because one day I will have a system that will be able to present stuff that way, and I'll be giggling like an idiot. The film is presented in DTS MA 2.0 mono with English SDH subtitles, and the menu is in 3D. So when you click over to watch it in 3D, even like the menu looks like it's got depth and stuff, which is a nice touch and pretty cool. Extras on this. There is, the one thing about this movie, I'm glancing not so delicately at my notes. One thing that's interesting in this movie is that there's this repeating motif, which again goes into that whole Space Vision 3D, of some object being on the screen. And it's usually like some kind of like Japanese artifact or figurine or ceramic that just like a scene will end where the people are talking and they walk away and the shot holds and there's this thing that's on the screen and it kind of moves around and then fades out. And I think that's them exploiting that idea of the thing floating out over the audience. In Anaglyph, it really didn't work, but I believe in the BR3D it does. In theaters, it certainly did because that's why they do it. The extras here. Sorry. Also, Arch Oboler does a voiceover at the beginning and the end. The beginning of the film reminds me of what they used to do on 3D TV in the 80s, which they would run this test reel where you basically set your tint, set your glasses, make sure everything looks okay. Okay, ready? Everything 3D looks good? Okay, here we go. There's a little bit of that at the beginning with a little Arch Oboler voiceover. And then at the end, during the credits, he basically gives supplemental credits verbally, which is interesting. It feels like old TV, or it feels like they forgot to put some things when they printed the credits in there. And Arch stepped in to say it. So he would say things like, Furs by Lorraine. It's kind of weird to see in a theatrical film, but I thought it was kind of fun and kooky. The extras here are a commentary by Matthew Rovner with Mike Ballou. Very interesting, gets into all the technical aspects of Space Vision 3D, the history of Space Vision 3D, the history of this film, Arch Oboler. I love stuff like this. I'm fascinated by 3D. I love these releases that the 3D Film Archive has been putting out over the last several years. So I just kind of gobble all this supplemental stuff up. There is a 3D burlesque short that was written by Ed Wood called Cleopatra Follies from 1953. That is obviously in 3D. And it's basically just three dancers going through their routines in a sunny backyard setting. Not as far as I recall, no nudity, but buy the disc and find out. The Skid Row Hold Up, 11 minutes. It is a burlesque dancer short with a comedy duo, so it's like you're watching a burlesque act. Really good depth in this. The comedy is corny, but I find it funny, and it's what you would have seen if you went to a burlesque house back then. What you would have seen if you were sitting in the audience at a burlesque house in more ways than one. It's what you would have seen on stage, and they used to run shorts like this in burlesque houses between the acts sometimes. And then you get Domo Arigato outtakes, and they are 3 minutes and silent, and it's basically just multiple takes of certain shots, but that's kind of cool to see. So, packaging. We get a cover featuring our two youthful leads, front and back. you get the disc, and you get a single pair of the Anaglyph 3D glasses. So if you want to watch it with friends, if you are into 3D like I'm into 3D, you probably have several pairs of glasses already. If you have other releases from the 3D Film Archive, you probably have the pairs of glasses. I watched it alone, so it wasn't a big deal. But eventually I want to get, I know they sell plastic, like sunglasses, 3D glasses. Eventually I want to get that and not worry about getting a fingerprint on the paper glasses and then they're no good and you have to throw them away. Anyway, thank you, Bayview Entertainment and 3D Film Archive, for bringing into my life, at long last, Domo Arigato.